Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Modern humans have been here for about 300,000 years. Our first cities started to appear around 6,000 years ago. Heavy industry? That's really only the last 200 years. On that kind of timescale, everything from steam engines to smartphones fits into a tiny sliver at the end. But if the planet has been changing and recording events for billions of years, how sure can we be that nothing like us ever rose and fell long before our chapter even started? Welcome to the Nocturne History, where mystery meets the edge of sleep. Tonight, we drift into deep time, billions of years compressed into hours, tracing questions that don't get asked often enough. Whether you're here to learn, to let your mind wander, or simply to settle in and let the past hum in the background, stay with these ideas. We'll move through geological layers, vanished coastlines, and silent gaps in the fossil record, watching how certainty breaks down when you push far enough back. This is meant for night, when questions can settle without needing immediate answers. When scientists talk about deep time, they aren't thinking in centuries, but in millions and hundreds of millions of years. Entire worlds of climate, oceans, and life can come and go in a 100 million year stretch. Yet when we look at that vast timeline, we usually treat our own rise to technology as the first and only attempt. Why are we so certain a technological civilization is a one-time accident instead of something that might have happened more than once on a restless planet like Earth? In 2018, astrophysicist Adam Frank and climate scientist Gavin Schmidt published a paper asking a strange question now known as the Silurian hypothesis. They weren't claiming dinosaurs built cities. They asked, if an industrial civilization had existed millions of years before humans, what traces would it leave in the geological record? Some colleagues treated it as a thought experiment and quietly filed it away. But the question cuts deeper than a single paper. Are we actually looking for those traces in the right way, or just assuming we'd obviously see them? Think about a modern coastal city. Waves slap against concrete. Air full of salt and exhaust eats away at steel. If everyone vanished tomorrow, in 50 years you'd see broken windows, plants breaking through pavement, rust everywhere. In 1 million years, even the rubble would be buried or washed away, and in 10 million years that coastline might not even exist. Would any future geologist recognize city there, or just note a messy patch of rock and move on? The surface of Earth doesn't just sit and age, it is constantly being rebuilt. Ocean crust is pushed down into the mantle and recycled every 150 to 200 million years, while continents crash together and grind old rocks to dust. At the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, about 66 million years ago, a thin iridium-rich clay layer marks the asteroid impact that helped wipe out the dinosaurs, yet that world-ending event is held in only a few centimeters of sediment. If something that huge is reduced to a narrow stripe in the rocks, what would a brief technological age look like in the same archive? And how easily could its signal be dismissed as ordinary geology? We already know our own age is leaving a unique mark. Since around 1850, carbon dioxide has climbed from about 280 parts per million to over 420. Plastics have sunk into deep-sea sediments, and synthetic fertilizers have altered the nitrogen balance of soils. Mid-20th century nuclear tests spread isotopes like cesium-137 across the planet. Some geologists argue this justifies naming a new epoch, the Anthropocene, though the formal proposal has been set aside and the idea remains disputed. If future researchers only saw our layer as a brief chemical spike with odd isotopes, would they read industry or argue over volcanoes and impacts? To stay honest, we need clear boundaries. We are not saying there were secret empires of tool-using reptiles or that every odd rock is proof of lost machines. Most scientists would call that speculation and quietly set it aside. But even the cautious story has gaps. Our sample of ancient seabeds and old river plains is thin compared to the total area that once existed, and many older rocks have been folded, baked, or eroded away. If we only see scattered pieces of the puzzle, how safe is it to say, nothing like us ever existed, rather than, we haven't seen clear evidence yet? It's not about proving someone came before us. It's about shrinking our confidence and stretching our sense of time. We live in a world where our species fills only the last 300,000 years, and heavy industry only about 2 centuries. Could Earth have hosted other technological experiments that burned bright and then disappeared into the machinery of plate tectonics and erosion? If so, what kind of fingerprints would they leave behind for us to notice? If someone did come before us, their skylines and machines are almost certainly gone. Their ports would have been eroded, their roads buried, their archives turned back into dust, yet one kind of record still runs through everything: the rocks and the fossils locked inside them. That record usually tells a neat story of slow change. Species appearing, thriving, and vanishing in order. But where would the story bend or break if another civilization had briefly changed the rules? Would we see strange fossils out of place, sudden disappearances, or layers whose chemistry refuses to match the patterns around them? Picture yourself standing at the base of a weathered cliff, your hand on bands of stone that span hundreds of millions of years. Fossils in some layers line up with the story we expect, while others raise quiet doubts. Teeth where they shouldn't be, tools said to be intrusive, traces that feel out of place. We're left with unease rather than an answer. If we are truly the first, why does Earth's past hold so many sharp turns and missing pieces? If we are not, how many times has the planet reset the stage without leaving anyone clearly to blame? And what does it mean if our own epoch is just one more thin layer in that stack? Shift your gaze from the cliff face to the sheer amount of time it represents, and let one last thought wander. If the rocks can hide whole worlds in a few centimeters, what else might be sitting there? Quiet, unrecognized, because we haven't learned how to read it yet. Earth's crust holds a record that stretches back billions of years, but our view of that record is narrow. Out of all the animals and plants that ever lived, only a fraction were buried in the right conditions to fossilize. Fewer survived heat and pressure, and only some have ever been exposed and studied. The rest are gone. But if the fossil record is this thin and selective, how can we be so sure the story it tells is complete, and that nothing unsettling hasn't slipped quietly through the gaps? Most of the time, the rocks seem to cooperate. Layer after layer, you can trace shells, bones, and leaves changing shape as millions of years pass, simpler forms below, more complex ones above. Yet even in that neat picture, there are brutal breaks. The boundary 252 million years ago that marks the Permian-Triassic extinction shows a layer where more than 80% of marine species vanish from the record. The Cretaceous-Paleogene line, 66 million years ago, catches the sudden end of the non-avian dinosaurs. Why do whole ecosystems disappear between one layer and the next, as if someone slammed a door on an entire world and walked away? Paleontologists explain these disasters with powerful natural forces. Massive volcanic eruptions, shifting continents, changing oceans, and large impacts can all disrupt life on a planetary scale, and most researchers accept these as the main drivers and move on. Yet when you look closely at some intervals, the pattern still feels unsettling. Long stretches of gradual change, then a spike, a crash, and a new cast of species in the layers above. Why do some transitions feel almost too sudden, even when we stretch time out over millions of years? And why are we so confident there's nothing more going on than the explanations we already prefer? There are also moments when complexity seems to jump forward. Around 541 million years ago, during the Cambrian explosion, fossil beds like the Burgess Shale in Canada and Chengjiang in China preserve an abrupt burst of new body plans, trilobites, spiky hunters, and soft-bodied creatures that don't fit neatly into modern groups. Mainstream science sees this as an evolutionary acceleration shaped by genetics and shifting environments, and that may be enough. However, the way so many new forms appear in a relatively narrow slice of time has led some observers to wonder if the record is hiding steps we haven't yet seen. Why does this section look less like a slow sketch and more like a reveal? And what might be missing between the frames? Outside the journals, you hear a different kind of story. Fossils that shouldn't exist at all. People share tales of human-like footprints pressed into rocks, supposedly tens of millions of years too old, or of objects like the so-called London hammer, a metal tool said to be locked inside ancient stone. These stories spread fast because they promised to break the timeline. Yet when geologists and archaeologists investigate, most cases turn out to be intrusive rocks, misdated layers, or hoaxes, and experts usually dismiss them without much hesitation. But even when specific claims fail, why does the idea keep returning and finding an audience? Why does the myth of the impossible fossil refuse to die? The persistence of these legends points to something real. People sense that the official story has blind spots, even if the proof they share doesn't stand up. The deeper mystery isn't whether one hammer is genuine. It's how incomplete the archive actually is. Fossilization favors hard parts, bones, shells, teeth, and buried environments like seabeds and river deltas. Yet our own civilization is built mostly from materials that do not age well on geological timescales. Steel rusts, concrete crumbles, glass shatters, and plastics break into tiny fragments that are hard to trace. If most of our physical world slowly turns back into anonymous sediment, what kinds of traces could realistically survive tens of millions of years? And would we recognize them if we saw them? We can already see the first hints of our layer forming. Microplastics show up in deep ocean cores. Fly ash from coal-burning leaves distinctive microscopic spheres in sediments. Industrial chemicals and fertilizers alter the ratios of nitrogen and other elements in soils. Most of this will never become a tidy artifact like a fossil bone. However, taken together, it creates unusual chemical and physical signatures in the strata. If we stumbled on a similar pattern in rocks 100 million years old, would we recognize it as a possible clue to technology, or simply explain it away as an odd form of volcanism or sedimentary noise? And if we explained it away too quickly, would anyone even notice? Mainstream geology tends to favor the simplest natural explanations, and most of the time that caution is justified. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the rock record does not currently offer a clear fingerprint of any earlier technological age. Yet that same caution can become a quiet filter. Layers that don't quite fit expectations are set aside as local quirks. Strange concentrations of elements are labeled complex diagenesis and left in the footnotes. Odd fossils are called reworked and pushed back into familiar boxes. Each decision may be reasonable on its own, but taken together, do they hint at a deeper reluctance to admit how much we still don't know about the worlds that came before us? Why are we so sure the story is complete when the evidence is this patchy? If we imagine a prior technological civilization, we shouldn't expect to find skyscrapers in stone, we should expect tiny, stubborn anomalies buried inside long runs of ordinary rock. Out-of-place concentrations of metals, repeated chemical spikes, or abrupt biological turnovers might be the only fossils such a civilization would leave on million-year timescales. Yet even if such signals existed, they would be easy to overlook in a record that is already thin and heavily eroded. Why would anyone go hunting for a story almost everyone assumes cannot be true in the first place? And if almost no one is looking, how much could we be missing? Picture yourself standing in front of a museum display. A neat row of fossils, labels tracing a smooth line from early forms to later ones. Now imagine stepping away from the glass and out to the field, where real rock sections are broken, incomplete, and cut by gaps we cannot fill. If even those tiny fragments raise questions about jumps, crashes, and sudden disappearances, what does that say about the vanished landscapes that once held the living creatures themselves? If odd moments already hide inside a few bones and thin layers, what might be waiting offshore, where whole coastlines and cities could lie drowned? And what happens to our certainty when the solid ground can erase worlds we will never see? Now step toward those hidden shorelines and sunken edges of continents, to the places where the land meets the sea and then quietly sinks below it, and ask, if fossils can mislead us on land, what stories might still be sealed away in cities beneath the waves? In 2000, survey teams in Egypt's Abukir Bay began lifting carved stone from shallow water. Statues, columns, temple blocks, linked to a port called Thonis Heracleion. For more than 1,200 years, it sat in a strange half-life, named in old sources but treated as lost, which often becomes a quiet reason to stop searching. Yet you can stand near modern Alexandria, look over calm water, and know a working harbor once sat just offshore under a few meters of sea. It handled ships, taxes, and temple traffic, and then it slipped out of sight. If a major port can vanish within recorded history, why do we picture the past as safely anchored to dry land? The explanation is simple, but the scale is uncomfortable. During the last ice age, global sea level was roughly 120 meters lower than today, and as the planet warmed, especially between about 15,000 and 8,000 years ago, the ocean rose and redrew coastlines again and again. But people favor coasts for the same reasons we do: food, travel, trade, and flat ground. If shorelines moved inland by kilometers, why wouldn't the oldest waterfronts now sit offshore, beyond the reach of normal excavation? Step closer to a sonar screen and watch the seabed appear as thin lines. Most of the time it's noise, but sometimes the lines snap into right angles. Off southern Greece, Pavlopetri is a submerged settlement with mapped lanes and building outlines, often linked to the Bronze Age, around 5,000 years old depending on which layers you trust. Yet storms shift sand, anchors bite into older layers, and objects drift. When the sea keeps rearranging a site, how confident should we be about what belongs together? With Thonis Heracleion, the question isn't whether something is there, but how it went down. Researchers point to subsidence, rising sea level, earthquakes, and waterlogged ground that can liquefy and let heavy stones sink. However, lost clung to the place for so long that the word started acting like a conclusion. Why does a label end curiosity so easily when it explains nothing by itself? Imagine a diver's torch sweeping across the seabed and catching the edge of a stone circle. Atlit Yam, off the coast of Israel, includes stone-built homes, a well, and human burials underwater, often dated to around 9,000 years ago. But why was it abandoned? Gradual sea rise could have pushed families back step by step, yet sudden disaster, like a tsunami, has also been suggested. If one village can be sealed under a few meters of sea, how many early coastal communities are missing from our timelines simply because the water took their foundations? Some underwater finds become arguments before they become knowledge, and that changes how they're handled. Near Dwarka on India's coast, underwater features have been investigated for decades, and some claim they confirm a grand city described in tradition. However, many archaeologists urge caution because natural rock can mimic walls, and even genuine structures may belong to later periods than people assume. The same evidence can be celebrated as final proof or dismissed as coincidence, with little room in between. Why does nuance get so little oxygen when the answer is almost certainly complicated? Dating underwater ruins adds its own fog because the ocean interferes with the clock. Radiocarbon dating depends on organic material, but underwater samples can be scarce, contaminated, or affected by marine reservoir effects that can skew ages unless corrected. Yet even a clean date can float free of meaning if currents have mixed layers or storms have scoured a site. How many mapped ruins get explained away too quickly as undateable, then quietly set aside until someone can return and sample again? And budget is not a footnote. It decides what kind of past we can afford to see. Underwater archaeology is slow and expensive, and it often receives less support than land digs. Projects start, a few seasons of results appear, then funding dries up and work stalls. But a stalled project makes the seabed look blank on paper, and blank starts to sound like nothing there. Why are findings so often overlooked simply because the work is difficult and the payoff is slow? Now widen the lens to entire drowned landscapes. Doggerland, beneath the North Sea, once connected Britain to mainland Europe, and evidence of people there, bones, tools, worked pieces, has surfaced for decades alongside seabed mapping, yet it remains more reconstruction than place, because you can't casually excavate a vanished plane under cold water and busy shipping lanes. If a whole landscape can disappear beneath a few dozen meters of sea, what else disappeared with it? Paths, camps, meeting places, and the routes between them. It's tempting to say, if it mattered, we would have found it. But that confidence rests on where we've looked, not on what existed. We build timelines from what survives on land, then treat what's missing as proof it was never there. However, dismissal isn't disproof, and silence can be a sampling problem. Why are we so certain about beginnings when the likeliest evidence sits underwater? Why do we trust gaps carved by geography, not by truth? And why does certainty rise fastest in the places we've searched the least? So the sea doesn't just hide walls and streets, it hides context, how people moved, traded, and measured their world. Shorelines vanish, but routes can be remembered, and charts can be copied. But who copied them, and for whom? What details would a careful map preserve that a coastline no longer shows? And what happens when a map outlives the coastline it describes? Picture yourself standing at a wooden table where a cartographer traces a coast by lamplight from older sheets, then copies that copy again, keeping the outline even after the land itself has changed. In 1929, inside Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, scholars unfolded a torn map fragment and found a date written on it, 1513. It's signed by the Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis, and the unsettling part isn't only the coastline shapes, it's the margin note. He said he compiled it from older sources, about 20 charts and world maps, plus a map he associated with Columbus. One surviving scrap is now more than 500 years old, while the source maps that fed it are gone, lost to fire, water, war, or simple neglect. If a map admits it had parents, what exactly is it remembering, and what did the world lose when those parents vanished? Picture the parchment laid flat under a warm lamp, the ink still confident where the edges are torn away. You can trace the Atlantic and feel how quickly the mind wants a dramatic explanation. But the quieter possibility is more interesting. Maps are portable memory. If ports drowned and coastlines shifted, why wouldn't route knowledge keep moving anyway? Carried by sailors who cared less about preserving culture and more about making landfall alive. However, before we chase impossible knowledge, look at the most practical miracle of medieval navigation, the portolan chart. From roughly the late 1200s onward, Mediterranean portolans drew coasts and harbors with a sharpness that can still surprise you, crossed by compass lines like a web. They usually ignore inland detail because they were made to be used, not admired. Why does a hand-drawn shoreline sometimes feel more trustworthy than our modern assumptions about what was possible back then? The standard explanation is not mystical at all. Accumulated experience. Sailors took bearings with a magnetic compass, estimated distance by speed and time, compared notes, then corrected charts as ships returned. Yet the sea is not a calm laboratory, and correction is expensive when mistakes cost cargo, reputations, and lives. So why do some portolans look so clean, as if messy voyages were turned into tidy geometry without leaving fingerprints? Lean in for a second and consider what these charts don't show. Portolans can be locally excellent while being globally wrong, because they grow outward like a patchwork. A coastline can be accurate, yet the broader shape of the world can still be warped, especially before reliable longitude at sea. But when a map gets one region right, people start trusting it everywhere. Why do we let one pocket of accuracy buy so much confidence? Now imagine the map isn't born from waves, but from a book. In the 2nd century CE, Ptolemy described a world laid out with coordinates, and his geography later shaped Renaissance cartography when copies circulated again in Europe. But Ptolemy's world had gaps. Unknown coasts filled with guesses, and longitudes that couldn't be measured well at sea for most sailors. Yet later, mapmakers sometimes treated his framework as solid ground and built confidently on it. Why do inherited frameworks feel so authoritative even when their creators knew they were provisional? If you want to watch information leak across borders, step into the early 1500s and look at maps like the Cantino Planisphere of 1502, a snapshot of Portuguese knowledge that ended up outside Portugal. Knowledge moved through trade, diplomacy, and sometimes plain theft, and a copied coastline could outrun the ships that first saw it. But copies also introduce distortions, especially when makers hide secrets or fill blanks with guesses. When a coastline looks too early for its time, is it proof of lost knowledge, or proof that knowledge traveled faster than we like to admit? In 1154, Al-Idrisi compiled a world map and geographic text in Sicily for King Roger II, pulling reports from merchants and travelers across the Mediterranean and beyond. It's a reminder that knowledge doesn't belong to one empire. It rides along routes. However, the farther you get from well-traveled corridors, the softer the details become because travel is what sharpens the picture. If accuracy clusters around movement, what happens to places that were known, then forgotten, then remembered only as a rumor? And the ocean itself behaves like a road with invisible signs. In the Indian Ocean, sailors learned monsoon winds, seasonal patterns that carry you one way for months and then reverse, and entire trading systems were built around that rhythm. In the Pacific, Polynesian navigators used stars, swells, and the behavior of birds and clouds to hold long routes in memory. In the Marshall Islands, stick charts represented wave patterns and island relationships rather than coastlines. Yet these systems were long misunderstood and quietly filed away as curiosities. Why do we call knowledge advanced only when it looks like our own paperwork? This is where the Piri Reis fragment becomes a test of our instincts. Some modern writers claim parts of it preserve Antarctica, even suggesting an ice-free shoreline known long ago. Most scholars dismiss that reading, noting that early maps often included speculative southern lands, and that compilation errors can twist familiar coasts into unfamiliar shapes. But dismissal isn't the same as explanation, and popular takes can swing the other way too, either treated as a solved hoax or hailed as forbidden truth, often dismissed as coincidence or explained away too quickly without careful comparison. Why the rush to declare victory either way? Why the resistance to leaving uncertainty on the page? Why not test claims slowly with the same patience we demand in every other kind of history? The more grounded mystery is still large enough to keep you awake. Lost source maps. Cartographers copied earlier charts, sometimes admitting they used old material, sometimes letting the copy pretend it was original, and every generation preserved some details while warping others. Phantom islands persisted for centuries. Coastlines drifted. A single mistake could harden into tradition because redrawing the world is harder than inheriting it. Yet those stubborn repeats might also preserve real threads from older shorelines, now changed or submerged, details that get overlooked because they don't fit a neat story. If a coastline on paper outlives the coastline in nature, what exactly is the map preserving? Truth, error, or a mix that no one can untangle anymore? So we're left with two possibilities sitting side by side, neither fully comforting. Either old maps are brilliant improvisation, human skill stretched to its limit, or some of them might carry fragments of older knowledge, copied from charts that no longer survive. Yet both paths lead to the same practical question. What tools turn sky and sea into usable numbers? What instruments sat in sailors' hands, and what devices sat on workshop benches, quietly translating the world into measurements? Shift your gaze from the ink to the work table and look for the hard objects that make mapping possible. Discs, gears, calibrated marks. Because if the chart was the memory, what was the machine that taught the hand how to draw? In 1901, sponge divers off the Greek island of Antikythera were working a shipwreck roughly 50 meters down when they brought up something no one was looking for. The obvious treasures were there: statues, coins, bronze scraps, things you can name in a single glance. But one corroded lump didn't look like treasure at all, until it cracked and showed gear teeth inside, stacked and meshed like a purpose-built device. For years, it was just a strange bronze thing among the finds because corrosion can hide design. Yet, as it was studied more closely, especially with later imaging, the pattern became harder to ignore. This was not decoration, it was mechanism. Today we call it the Antikythera mechanism, usually dated around the 2nd to 1st century BCE, more than 2,000 years old, and reconstructed as a machine that can track astronomical cycles. That's not folklore, it's engineering, surviving by accident. Why would a culture capable of building this leave us so little else that looks similar? And why does that absence make people so certain the device must be unique? Step closer to a museum case and notice what survives: broken plates, gear fragments, and faint inscriptions that needed imaging to read. Reconstructions suggest it could model the sun and moon cycles with mechanical ratios, and that alone changes what ancient can mean. Yet for decades, it sat in the category of exception, almost quietly filed away as an oddity. Why do we feel safer when an uncomfortable artifact stays alone? The standard explanation is calm. Hellenistic engineers were capable, and we don't see more because bronze is recycled and wood decays. But that answer also means the tradition is mostly invisible. inferred from one survivor and a few scattered hints. If survival depends on luck, fires, and recycling, why are we confident the record shows the full range of what was built? Now shift from gears to stone, because stone is supposed to keep its secrets less easily. At Tiwanaku and Pumapunku in Bolivia, tight joints and sharp interior corners can look almost machined when you see them close up. However, precision is a loaded word, and it invites people to jump straight to power tools or fraud. Most archaeologists point to careful measurement, pounding, grinding, and abrasives, and that could explain a lot. But why does the discussion so often end with a label instead of a test? Imagine running your fingertips along a drilled hole in hard granite and trying to picture the tool that made it. In Egypt, drill holes and stone cores have been debated for generations, including notes by Flinders Petrie in the 1800s. The mainstream view is that copper tools plus abrasives, used long enough, can cut very hard stone, and experiments support that in principle. Yet some marks look so regular that they're either treated as proof of lost methods or explained away too quickly as misreadware. Why not slow down and demand replication under the same constraints? Then there's the Sabu disc, found at Saqqara and typically dated to Egypt's first dynasty, around 3000 BCE. It's thin, with a central hub and 3 curved blades, and it looks uncomfortably like a component more than a bowl. Most Egyptologists interpret it as a ritual vessel, and that may be right because shape alone doesn't prove function. But why does this object keep pulling people back into the same question anyway? What was it meant to do? This is why ghost machines is a useful phrase, not a claim of secret factories. The most technical-looking parts, gears, fittings, calibrated pieces, are the easiest to lose. They get melted down, reused, or broken for scrap. But stone persists, and sometimes it preserves a workshop's fingerprint. Saw lines, drill holes, repeated angles, standardized shapes. If you only inherit the stone, what story are you missing about the missing tools? It's also a fact about human history that feels like an insult, so we avoid it. Technology can regress. The Antikythera mechanism doesn't lead into a neat parade of similar devices and everyday finds, and people rush to extremes to explain the gap. Yet crafts can vanish when economies collapse, when trade routes break, and when specialist makers die without apprentices. If a tradition can disappear in a few generations, why do we demand a smooth, continuous trail in the ground? And when researchers try to sit in the honest middle, we're not sure yet, but it's worth testing, those projects can be overlooked because they're expensive and slow, or because funding dried up for anything that sounded controversial. But dismissal isn't disproof, and ridicule isn't measurement. Why not treat uncertainty as a map of where the real work should go? Now let the questions stack, because the stack is the point. If one geared calculator survived by luck, why couldn't there have been more? If there were more, why didn't they survive? Recycling, decay, shipwrecks, conquest. If they didn't survive, what would remain? Stone scars, strange discs, half-understood parts in drawers, things dismissed without serious investigation because they don't fit a clean story. And if we can't answer those questions cleanly, why talk as if the mystery is finished? What this chapter leaves you with is a fragile picture. Skill can appear, skill can vanish, and the evidence we inherit is whatever happens to endure. But if precision on the ground was real, what was it for? What cycles were being tracked? What measurements were being trusted? What patterns were being kept? Picture yourself beside a ring of stones at first light, watching a narrow gap frame the horizon with uncomfortable accuracy. Who kept that record? For how long? And what were they trying to predict when they looked up? In the late 1960s, an archaeologist stood inside Newgrange in Ireland, an earthen mound built around 3200 BCE. and watched a thin blade of sunrise enter through a roof box above the doorway. For a few minutes at the winter solstice, that light runs down the passage and reaches the inner chamber. It's unsettling. A structure more than 5,000 years old seems to meet the sun on one morning each year. This isn't the loose facing east you get by chance. The path of light is narrow enough to feel intentional. But who chose that day, and how long did they watch to be sure? Picture the scene without romance. Cold air, stone under your fingertips, and a corridor that stays black until it suddenly isn't. You can call it ceremony, and you might be right. Yet ceremony doesn't cancel measurement. It depends on it. A solstice rule only works if people admit error and correct it. Why build a calendar you can't carry unless timing mattered so much that close enough wasn't close enough? Now widen your gaze to Stonehenge. One famous line points toward the summer solstice sunrise, and another draws attention toward the winter solstice sunset. But famous sites become slogans, and slogans hide the labor of accuracy. Most archaeologists emphasize social and ritual meaning alongside astronomy, and that balance is fair. Yet why does ritual sometimes get used like a full explanation, as if precision arrives for free? Step back and ask what skywatching really takes. It isn't just looking up once, it's staying consistent through cloudy seasons and forgettable years. However, the sun's turning points are the easy lesson. The moon is harder. The lunar month is about 29.5 days, and the moon's extreme rising and setting points swing over a longer rhythm, including an approximately 18.6-year standstill cycle. If a community tracked that slow swing, who held the record long enough to be sure? Look south to Nabta Playa in the Egyptian desert, where stone features have been discussed as possible astronomical markers and sometimes dated to the 6th to 5th millennium BCE. But interpretation here is fragile. Stones can move, patterns can appear by chance, and dates can be argued. The mainstream stance is cautious, and caution is healthy. Yet cautious can slide into dismissal, with the question treated as coincidence and set aside because it's messy. Why do we demand clean certainty from evidence that was never meant to survive perfectly? Consider the Maya, because they left texts and mathematics, not only alignments. Their calendar systems tracked multiple cycles, and sites like Chichen Itza are often linked to seasonal timing. Most scholars explain this as careful observation over generations, tied to agriculture and ceremony. But if repeated watching can build that kind of record, why assume earlier peoples never kept long counts simply because their written records didn't survive in our libraries? If you want a sky tradition to last, you need more than a clever idea. You need a chain of teaching. You can't prove an alignment from one year. You need repetition, correction, and memory shared across people. Yet continuity is fragile. Drought, migration, conflict, or leadership change can break a record in a generation. And when modern research stays slow and uncertain, it can be overlooked too, especially when funding dried up for long surveys. Why do we punish uncertainty by turning it into silence? This is where shared star stories become tempting, and also risky if we rush them. Many cultures point to Orion and the Pleiades, and you can find hunter figures and Seven Sisters clusters across distances. But the sky is the same canvas for everyone, and humans naturally turn bright dots into characters, so similarity could be coincidence as easily as contact. Still, why do some motifs feel oddly specific, as if they were translations of an older rule rather than fresh inventions? A safer way to hold it is to imagine a calendar language that can travel without a single empire behind it. Planting cues, navigation seasons, and ritual dates can move like recipes, adapted locally, but preserving recognizable logic. Yet debates over diffusion versus independent invention get forced into extremes, and the middle ground gets brushed past because it isn't dramatic. Why are we so resistant to mixed answers when trade, marriage, and migration have always mixed people? Bring the thought back down to earth. Tools rot, records burn, coastlines shift, and settlements vanish from view. But the sky keeps repeating its cycles, offering a way to rebuild a calendar after a break. Yet rebuilding takes time, and time requires stability. If older networks once shared measurements and seasonal rules, what would remain after disruption? Perfect monuments everywhere, or broken traditions that still point roughly true? So the Skywatchers leave a stubborn mystery. Careful timing appears again and again, but the record is thin. Some alignments are clear, some are disputed, and some are explained away too quickly because the evidence is hard to package. Who taught the first long count habits when no one could rely on ink? Why do certain stones and stories keep pointing to the same directions and dates? And if that knowledge could move between far-flung watchers of the sky, why wouldn't other things move with it? Picture yourself standing at a river mouth where inland currents meet open sea, with boats pulled onto the bank and strangers arriving with unfamiliar materials. Imagine the same stars overhead, but new objects in the hands below. Shift your gaze from the horizon to the shoreline paths and ask the practical question hiding inside the wonder. If the sky gave people a shared clock, what kind of routes would that clock help organize? In 1991, a hiker in the Alps found a human body melting out of the ice near the border of Austria and Italy. The tests that followed were the unsettling part. Otzi, the Iceman, had lived more than 5,000 years ago, and his gear made no sense if he'd lived in isolation. His tools used copper that came from far away. His clothes mixed materials from different regions. Even his last meal hinted at trade, ingredients not native to the same valley. But a lone traveler is not a civilization. So why does one frozen man hint at a web of exchange we can barely see? Picture a shoreline before ports had piers. Trade was a pile of goods on sand and a deal sealed with a gesture. A necklace of shells, a piece of obsidian, a pouch of salt. Small things, but each one proof that contact already existed. Yet trade doesn't need empires or roads. It only needs memory and repetition. A route that's walked often enough to become a story. Why do we imagine early humans as cut off from each other when rivers and coasts were always the easiest roads on Earth? Obsidian proves it. Every volcanic source leaves a chemical fingerprint, and archaeologists have traced obsidian blades hundreds of kilometers from their origin. But because this movement was quiet, one hand to another over generations, it rarely gets attention. Historians love kings and wars, not the slow traffic of tools and ideas. Yet if a single shard of volcanic glass can travel across mountains, why couldn't knowledge or belief travel the same invisible road? Now step into the ancient Mediterranean. Before compasses and charts, sailors learned the islands by sight and the winds by feel. Over time, habits became maps, currents that led to new coasts. But routes like these are fragile. One storm can erase a landing spot. One enemy can close a strait. And when sea levels rose after the last ice age, hundreds of early harbors disappeared. If those coastal settlements are now underwater, how many first contacts were really recontacts with people already trading there centuries before? Consider something even the mainstream accepts: the spread of Neolithic farming from the Near East into Europe. That movement wasn't a single migration. It was a slow ripple over thousands of years, people carrying seeds, animals, and habits. Yet that slow wave built shared architecture, shared pottery, even shared ritual. So why do we call it local just because it was gradual? Distance doesn't always mean speed. Sometimes it just means patience. Look east toward the Indian Ocean. Its monsoon winds flip direction every 6 months, creating a natural timetable for trade. Later civilizations used it openly, but coastal peoples could have noticed it much earlier. You don't need a written calendar to feel the seasons shifting at sea. Still, suggestions of early Indian Ocean navigation are often labeled coincidence or quietly filed away as unprovable. Why the hesitation to test what a dugout canoe and a few generations of experience could achieve? Cross further into the Pacific, to the Lapita culture. Seafarers whose pottery style and DNA trail trace thousands of kilometers across the ocean. Their world wasn't a single empire, it was a chain of islands linked by skill and memory. Yet whenever researchers describe ancient webs like this, many listeners imagine modern shipping routes and centralized control. Why not picture something subtler? A loose mesh of communities, each connected to a few neighbors, none seeing the entire network, yet all keeping it alive. Trade also moves symbols faster than it moves people. A pattern on a pot, a spiral carved into stone, a shared myth of a flood or serpent, these can travel without armies. But similarity is slippery evidence. People invent alike when they face alike problems. Most archaeologists urge caution, and they're right. Yet caution sometimes becomes refusal, and ideas that don't fit clean timelines are explained away too quickly. Why are we so allergic to the middle ground, where some things spread, others arise independently, and both truths coexist? Return to the sea level problem because it erases proof faster than time. Since the last ice age, global sea levels have risen more than 100 meters, drowning countless coastal plains. The earliest markets, the beaches, estuaries, and coves where people met, would now lie far below the waves. Wood rots, boats sink, ropes decay, and the shoreline moves on. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. If early sea trade existed, isn't it exactly what we'd expect to have vanished? Imagine how such a network might work in practice. A river leads to a delta. The delta leads to a bay. The bay opens to another coast. No one sails an ocean in one leap. They pass goods forward, beach by beach, year after year. In that slow relay, copper from the Alps could end up near the Baltic, or a shell from the Red Sea could reach a village in Anatolia. If myths and motifs appear on opposite sides of the world, why assume they were invented twice rather than shared once? Yet every network has a breaking point. Trade thrives on balance, on trust, rhythm, and stable weather. But that balance can snap quickly. If a coastline floods, a harvest fails, or a rival blocks a passage, entire regions lose their supply lines. A world built on exchange can collapse faster than a world built on isolation. Why do we picture ancient peoples as self-reliant survivors, when their greatest strength might have been dependence itself? So the deeper mystery isn't whether trade existed, it's how much of it we've lost to time. The clues that remain are quiet. A mineral out of place, a story that shouldn't match, a motif repeated across oceans. Most are overlooked or dismissed without serious investigation because they lack drama or funding. But dismissal isn't disproof, and silence doesn't erase pattern. How many of those fragments once belonged to a single web of exchange we no longer recognize? And if that web once circled the early world, what happened when its threads began to tear? Picture yourself standing on a narrow headland as two boats approach from opposite horizons, each crew wary, each holding something the other needs. Now, let a few centuries pass. The water rises. The crops fail. The same meeting becomes a confrontation. Shift your gaze from the calm exchange to the tension beneath it, and ask the question that echoes through legend. When trade collapses and trust dies with it, what kind of war follows? In 1996, along the Tollens River in northern Germany, a human arm bone came up from the water and it refused to stay small. Archaeologists returned and began finding more remains, skulls with blunt force trauma, arrow wounds, broken weapons, spread across several kilometers of valley. Not a tidy grave, but scattered pieces. A rib struck from behind, a shattered club, bronze arrowheads, fragments of what look like hurried fights on a narrow route. Over time, the evidence suggested well over 100 individuals, with the fighting usually dated to around 1250 BCE, more than 3,200 years ago. Many researchers think this reflects a large, organized clash, not a private feud. Yet there is no carved victory text, no named king, no neat battlefield map, just the aftermath. If this many people fought and died in one place, who gathered them there, and how did the story slip out of history so completely? Picture what war destroys first: storage, routine, and records. A city can survive a battle and still collapse afterward when grain is gone, trade is cut, and trust evaporates. But the archives, the parts that would tell you who attacked and why, are often the first to burn, rot, or get looted. Later generations inherit ruins and rumor, not minutes and maps, and careful investigation gets set aside when the trail is long and uncertain. Why are we surprised the past sounds vague, when violence is excellent at erasing its own paperwork? Oral tradition grows in that gap, and it has a brutal habit. It compresses long crises into one night, turns many causes into one villain, and gives suffering a shape people can retell. Yet it often begins with something real. A raid that became migration, a siege that became hunger, a border clash that became a hated name. That's how you end up with wars of the gods, cities destroyed overnight, and weapons that scorch the earth. Why assume it's only fantasy instead of memory rewritten into the only language that survived? Take the Mahabharata, where later retellings describe blinding brightness, weapons of fire, and destruction so sudden it sounds impossible. Some modern readers insist this must be literal advanced technology, and most scholars treat that leap as unsupported. We don't have a solid physical case for a prehistoric high-tech war, but dismissal isn't the same as explanation, and ridicule isn't evidence. If survivors saw burning projectiles, roofs collapsing, and smoke that turned noon into dusk, what words would they reach for other than fire from the sky? Now ask the quieter question hiding underneath. What does advanced look like to people who can't reproduce it? A coordinated coastal raid can feel like an enemy appearing from nowhere. An unfamiliar incendiary can look like a curse. A city losing its granaries can feel like the world ending. Yet the deadliest technology might simply be organization, routes, timetables, supply chains, and leaders who know where to strike. If the routes fail, who starves first? If fear spreads, who panics first? And if panic becomes routine, how long before strangers start to look like enemies? That's why the late Bronze Age collapse, roughly around 1200 BCE, matters even without any exotic claims. Across the eastern Mediterranean, palaces fell, trade networks snapped, and major centers were abandoned or reduced. The standard explanation points to multiple stresses: conflict, drought, internal unrest, movements of people, stacking until the system failed. Yet, multi-causal can become a label that quietly files the mystery away, like we're satisfied once we can list the pressures. Why are we confident about the ingredients, but still unsure about what actually tipped the first domino? Egyptian records tied to Ramesses III describe attacks by groups later labeled the Sea Peoples, but those records are a state speaking about itself, not a neutral camera above the sea. And the framing naturally simplifies. Outsiders arrive, order survives, the king stands firm. The fighting may be real, Yet the label invaders can hide the uncomfortable middle ground, displacement, hunger, and desperation, turning people into raiders. Why do we reach for a clean enemy when the coastline might already have been a pressure cooker? Ugarit on the Syrian coast is one place where panic leaks through the cracks. Letters suggest leaders pleading for help while danger closed in and the city was destroyed and never regained its old role. Yet even here, the final cause is debated. Attack, internal revolt, cascading shortages, or several at once, and the uncertainty is often explained away too quickly because it resists a clean headline. Why do we keep demanding one neat culprit when collapse arrives as a stack of smaller failures? So the war no one remembered may not be one war at all, but a pattern. Conflict, flaring along routes, cities falling and taking their records with them, survivors carrying fragments forward, some preserved, many overlooked because they sound too large. But war alone rarely finishes the job. What happens when fighting collides with a volcanic winter, a mega flood, or a rapid cold spell that kills harvests? What happens when trade breaks, then food breaks, then trust breaks, fast? Picture yourself on a street where the air smells wrong and the usual noises are missing. Imagine lamps sputtering because fuel is scarce, and messages arriving late because roads are no longer safe. Shift your gaze from the soldiers to the sky itself and ask the most unsettling question of all. If the human world is already cracking, what happens when the planet adds its own sudden blow? Cold, ash, flood, darkness, and the whole system falls silent overnight. In 1815, a mountain on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa blew itself open, and the number that matters isn't poetic, it's logistical. Tambora. Within months, ash and sulfur aerosols spread through the upper air, and 1816 became the year without a summer in parts of Europe and North America. Crops failed, food prices jumped, and people wrote about cold rains in months that usually feel safe. One eruption, one island, wide consequences. If one volcano can bend seasons across oceans, what happens to a connected society that can't feed itself for even one extra season? Now picture the first warning not as a blast, but as a quiet shortage. The fish don't run when they should, the grain heads stay thin, and the market has fewer baskets each week. But complex systems rarely break with one clean crack. They thin out, then snap. A port can survive a storm, yet fail months later when inland harvests collapse and ships stop arriving. Why do we keep imagining collapse as one dramatic day when the real mechanics are delayed, reactions stacking up behind ordinary routines? Volcanoes are the most honest, sudden disaster because they leave fingerprints in ash layers and ice. Around 536 CE, many researchers point to an extreme atmospheric veil event, likely driven by volcanic aerosols, followed by additional large eruptions in the 540s, with written sources describing a dim sun and bitter years. Yet for a long time, those accounts were treated as exaggeration, even explained away too quickly, until physical evidence forced a second look. Why are we so quick to distrust human description when the planet itself kept a record? Megafloods don't need space rocks. They only need water finding a new path. The Missoula floods, tied to ice-dammed lakes during the last glaciation, helped carve the channeled scablands in the Pacific Northwest, and for years the idea was dismissed as impossible because the scale sounded absurd. Yet the landscape kept the proof in giant ripples and torn channels. If floods like that hit river mouths where people stored grain and traded goods, what would remain besides scattered debris and a coastline rewritten in a single day? Then there are shocks that look like just climate, until you notice how quickly they turn. The Younger Dryas, beginning roughly 12,900 years ago, marks a rapid return to colder conditions in parts of the northern hemisphere after warming had begun. Most scientists discuss ocean circulation shifts and meltwater pulses, and that mainstream explanation is already unsettling because it shows stability can flip. But why do we crave a single clean trigger when nature often changes course with several hands at once? Now step into the last days at human height because systems fail in ordinary scenes. The first week, lamps still burn, but fuel is rationed. The next month, guards appear at granaries and people start traveling in groups. The harbor goes quiet, and that quiet feels heavier than noise, because silence means no arrivals and no news. Yet the most dangerous moment is the moment you realize nobody is coordinating anything anymore. If order is a habit, what happens when the habit breaks and there's no one left to answer? Knowledge fails faster than stone, and that fact should make anyone uneasy. A library is paper and ink, but it also needs dry air, repairs, and caretakers. Without maintenance, mold and fire win quickly. Digital memory looks safer, yet it depends on electricity, cooling, updates, and replacement parts, or files become corrupted, unreadable, or simply lost. But we talk about archives as if they're immortal. Why do we trust storage that fails the moment the caretakers disappear? Archaeology keeps proving how brutal this can be. Wood disappears, cloth disappears, and metal gets recycled into something else. Even writing can vanish in one generation. Tablets broken, scrolls damp, languages forgotten, until a script becomes mute, like Linear A, still unread. Yet when evidence is fragmentary, it's often quietly filed away as not enough, as if history only counts when it comes with a neat label. Why assume a lost world left nothing when something can survive as artifacts we can't yet place? This is where modern confidence can get too comfortable. If it happened, we'd have found it sounds firm. But the search is uneven, and the blanks are real. Deep seabeds, drowned shelves, deserts, forests, and ruins under modern streets. Whole projects stall when funding dried up or priorities shifted, and messy results get shelved because they don't produce easy headlines. But shelving a question isn't answering it. Why do we confuse what we haven't mapped with what never existed? Put it together, and the day their world fell silent stops being a cartoon apocalypse and becomes a convergence. Volcanic winters cutting harvests, floods breaking routes, conflict blocking supplies, maintenance failing, records disappearing. From a survivor's viewpoint, it still feels like one day, the day the usual signals stopped working and nobody could fix them. What warnings would survive when instruments and writing are gone? And what would get reshaped simply because it must fit inside human memory? Picture yourself close to a small fire while survivors trade the only currency they still own, a story. Shift your gaze from broken streets to the words that remain and listen carefully. Why do so many of those words sound like drowned kingdoms, angry sky powers, and a golden age that ended too fast? And if the facts burned while the feelings survived, what exactly are we hearing when we hear a myth? Now step into that circle of listeners and notice what survives best. Not dates, but symbols. In the 1870s, a clay tablet dug from the ruins of Nineveh carried a flood story that sounded uncomfortably familiar, and the number that matters is the time gap. Roughly 2,600 years from when it was written to when modern readers stared at its lines. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim survives a world-drowning deluge in a sealed boat, releases birds, and speaks like a man who watched an entire age get erased. Most scholars explain these flood myths as memory shaped by river life in places like Mesopotamia. But why do the details feel so specific? Warnings, boats, birds, mountains, when we had terrible floods would have been enough. Picture a small group after a disaster. close enough to hear each other clearly, with smoke still in the air and the ground still damp. They don't recite measurements, they build meaning. A storm becomes a test, a flood becomes judgment, and survival becomes proof that someone was chosen. Yet the brain isn't a library. It compresses, sharpens, and turns patterns into characters. Why do we expect clean facts from people whose first job is to make terror livable? That's the first rule of myth. It isn't a lie, but it isn't a report either. In Genesis, Noah is warned and builds an ark. In Greek tradition, Deucalion survives a flood sent by Zeus. Different cultures, different gods, similar bones of a story. But similarity can be coincidence, because floods happen everywhere, and humans reach for the same solutions: boats, high ground, warnings. Why is it still hard to shake the feeling that some of these stories are remembering more than a local river overflow? Now move from a flood happened to a world ended, because many traditions don't describe a bad season, they describe a reset. In South Asia, the story of Manu includes a warning from a fish and a flood that remakes the world. And in Mesoamerican traditions, cycles of creation and destruction appear in different forms across time and region. Most historians treat this as worldview, not geology, and that boundary matters. Yet why do so many cultures imagine history as cycles, ages rising, falling, and returning, unless cycles were felt physically in real experience? But myth doesn't only remember water. It remembers fire. Some traditions speak of a sky that burns, a sun that behaves strangely, or wrath arriving as heat, ash, and darkness. Mainstream scholarship usually reads this as moral language, and attempts to match every line to a specific eruption are often dismissed as coincidence. Yet dismissal isn't disproof, and the silence raises its own questions. Why do fire from the sky motifs keep appearing if no community ever saw nights lit by something it couldn't control? Look at the symbols that repeat, because symbols survive when details rot away. Serpents and dragons guard water or bring it. Boats appear as survival, not exploration. Mountains become refuges. Stars become clocks. But symbols also travel easily, and they can be borrowed without the original event behind them, which is why scholars are cautious. Still, why do certain clusters, water plus warning plus a vessel, fire plus darkness plus ruin, show up together so often, as if they're packaging memory in a form that can survive translation? Now bring Atlantis into the room carefully, because it attracts overclaiming like a magnet. Plato describes an island power that falls in a single day and night of misfortune, and plenty of people read that as coded history of a real catastrophe. Most classicists treat Atlantis primarily as a philosophical story, not an archaeological report, and literal readings get dismissed quickly. But Plato's imagery, sudden sinking, swallowed harbors, and age erased, hooks the mind anyway. Why would an invented story lean so hard on disaster unless disaster was a believable fear to its audience? However, there's a calmer possibility that's still unsettling. Myths may be mosaics. A local flood here, a coastal surge there, a famine after ash-darkened skies somewhere else, and then centuries of retelling glue them into one narrative that feels like one apocalypse. That would explain why a myth can be accurate in emotion and timing, yet unreliable in details. But popular debates force a false choice, either pure fiction or exact history. And anything in between gets quietly filed away as too messy. Why the resistance to complexity when human memory is complex by design? If writing survives, stories can be pinned down. If writing fails, stories become the only bridge. That's why people before us traditions matter even when they're hard to interpret. Some cultures speak of earlier ages, earlier builders, earlier beings. sometimes wise, sometimes arrogant, sometimes wiped away. Scholars are right to warn against turning every ancient one's tale into proof of a lost global civilization. Yet why do so many cultures feel compelled to say, in one form or another, we were not the first? Here's the tension that keeps returning through this series. Coastlines rise, cities drown, machines rust, records burn, and what remains is narrative. If a sea-focused world suffered repeated shocks after the Ice Age, flooding shelves, breaking routes, scattering populations, then myth is exactly what you'd expect to survive. But mainstream timelines often treat myth as decoration, something to quote and move on from. And that can make patterns easy to overlook because they don't fit tidy categories. Why do we trust broken pottery more than recurring structures in human storytelling, when both are fragments of the same past? Yet we also need restraint, because mystery can become a trap. Not every serpent is a memory of a tsunami, and not every fire is an impact. Sometimes a story is simply a story shaped by the need for meaning. But restraint shouldn't harden into reflexive dismissal, where curiosity gets explained away too quickly because it sounds uncomfortable. Why not hold two thoughts at once? Myths exaggerate, and exaggeration often grows around a real seed. So after the fire, only myths. Portable archives that can cross oceans without paper and survive collapse without power. But if myths are memory, a sharper question appears. Did anyone ever try to leave something more stable than a story? Something that could survive floods, fires, and forgetting? And if they tried, why do we assume we would recognize it immediately? What would a deliberate message look like if you had to speak across 10,000 years? Stone, chemistry, a pattern that doesn't depend on language. Why do we keep stumbling over odd layers, odd artifacts, and odd maps as if they're almost saying something but not quite? Picture yourself standing at the edge of a barren field where the soil changes color in a thin band, as if the earth is keeping a file. Now step closer and imagine someone choosing that layer on purpose, placing a marker where time would protect it. Shift your gaze from the storyteller's circle to the ground beneath your feet, and ask what kind of signature a lost world might leave when it wants to be found. In 1999, trucks began rolling into a facility in the New Mexico desert designed for one task: keep dangerous, radioactive waste away from living beings for longer than any civilization has ever lasted. The waste isolation pilot plant was built to seal material deep in salt beds, and the timescale isn't symbolic. Engineers talk about 10,000 years and beyond, which is long enough for languages to die, borders to vanish, and whole belief systems to flip. That creates a strange design brief. You're not just storing waste, you're trying to speak to strangers across deep time. How do you warn people who might not read your language, recognize your symbols, or even agree on what danger means? Picture a conference room where the marker problem turns into sketches. Some proposals were blunt, a jagged, hostile landscape meant to feel unpleasant, while others were almost cultural engineering, like keeping the warning alive through ritual and taboo, sometimes described as an atomic priesthood. Yet humans are curious by default, and curiosity is stubborn. Why wouldn't a future visitor treat a frightening monument as a dare, especially if the original context is gone and the place looks like a mystery begging to be solved? Now shift your attention to Finland, to the Onkalo repository carved into bedrock for similarly long horizons. The engineering is impressive, but the deeper weakness is interpretation. Rock can outlast us, while meaning can evaporate in a few generations. A marker might endure 50,000 years and still fail if it becomes a shrine, a legend, or a joke. But if even our best plans can't guarantee comprehension, why are we so confident we would recognize a deliberate time capsule from a culture we don't expect to have existed? That uncertainty is why messages buried in our past works best as a careful thought experiment, not a claim. If an earlier society wanted to speak across deep time, it probably wouldn't rely on paper, wood, or metal. It might choose geology and redundancy, multiple signals pointing to the same idea. Yet the moment you say deliberate marker, the topic is often dismissed as unnecessary speculation, quietly filed away because it sounds too big for a neat timeline. Why the resistance to simply asking what long-term communication could look like in a world that constantly erases its own footprints? A real geological signature would need to behave like nature's own signatures: abrupt, widespread, hard to blur. The classic example is the thin, iridium-rich layer associated with the end Cretaceous impact around 66 million years ago, a boundary found far beyond any single site. But nature also sets the standard: sharp boundaries, repeatable chemistry, broad distribution. So, if a past civilization left a marker, why wouldn't it aim for that same stubborn clarity, instead of a single artifact that can be melted down, stolen, or misidentified? However, there's a trap, because humans can turn any odd layer into a message if we want it badly enough. Ash bands can come from volcanism, dark layers from wildfires, strange ratios from shifting ocean chemistry, and sometimes the pattern is just uneven sampling. The standard explanation is boring on purpose. Earth is messy, and coincidence happens. Yet, probably natural can become don't bother looking, and ambiguous projects are the first to stall when funding dried up. Why not separate two questions? Is it natural? And is it worth testing? Instead of using the first as an excuse to avoid the second, ask the practical question that keeps this honest. If a civilization like ours vanished, what would actually persist in the long run? Plastics fragment, but they can become part of sediments. Concrete weathers, but it leaves distinctive mineral traces. Metals corrode, but they can shift local chemistry. None of this proves a lost world, and most researchers would say it's modern projection to hunt for ourselves in deep time. But why is projection treated as a shutdown instead of a reason to write strict criteria and then go looking to see if reality matches them? Now bring the earlier threads back and notice how they rhyme without requiring a single dramatic leap. Thonis, Heracleon shows that lost can mean under a few meters of water, not imaginary. The Piri Reis fragment shows how copied information can outlive the places it described. The Antikythera mechanism shows intricate devices can exist and then vanish from the record. Flood myths show memory can survive without writing at all. Yet when these pieces don't fit a clean story, they can be overlooked because they refuse to sit neatly in one category. Why do we demand one perfect smoking gun when history usually reaches us as scattered, imperfect survivals? So maybe the message is literal, maybe it's cultural, or maybe it's nothing at all and we're only seeing faces in clouds. But either way, the honest conclusion is uncomfortable. We are not reading a full book of history, we're reading torn pages in bad light. What would count as a signature strong enough to survive skepticism without sliding into conspiracy? If we found a repeating anomaly in chemistry, would we test it until it breaks, or dismiss it without serious investigation because it threatens the comfort of a finished timeline? Picture yourself standing at an exposed cut of Earth, where one thin line doesn't match anything above or below, and ask the quiet question that follows. If we can't even guarantee our warnings will be understood in 10,000 years, what makes us so sure we'd recognize theirs? In 1901, divers off the Greek island of Antikythera pulled corroded bronze from a shipwreck about 50 meters down and accidentally revealed a machine with gears inside it, dated roughly to the 2nd to 1st century BCE. That's an unsettling fact because it isn't a legend, And it isn't even debated as real or fake. It's simply real, sitting behind glass. But if one precision device can survive by accident for more than 2,000 years while thousands of others vanish, what does that say about how thin our evidence really is? And if our picture of the past depends on what survives by luck, why do we speak with such confidence about what couldn't have existed? Think back across what we've touched: drowned shorelines, copied maps, stone marks that look engineered, skies tracked like calendars, routes traced by obsidian, and myths that keep repeating after writing fails. Yet each time we approach something strange, Thonis, Heraclean under a few meters of water, Doggerland beneath the North Sea, Newgrange catching winter light, we also ran into the same wall. Not enough. Too messy. Probably coincidence. Sometimes that caution is healthy because history needs breaks. But why does caution sometimes harden into dismissal, as if protecting the timeline matters more than testing the edges of it? Now picture a simple modern scene. A bright city at night, power humming, screens glowing, shipping containers stacked like blocks. It feels permanent when you live inside it. Yet our world is also a web, and webs fail in chains. If one choke point breaks, food, energy, transport, how long until everyday life begins to feel unfamiliar, and how quickly do people stop trusting the system that used to lull them into routine? We don't need fantasy to see how fast memory can disappear, because we've already built archives that depend on constant maintenance. Paper burns, but servers also fail, and digital forever becomes unreadable if electricity, cooling, and replacement parts stop. Yet people talk about the record as if it's guaranteed, as if information is a rock. Why do we assume our story is safe when even a few weeks of disorder can set whole collections aside, and when funding dries up the quiet work that keeps knowledge usable? If we imagine a previous civilization, the most realistic version is not flying machines and glowing towers. It's something more familiar and more fragile. Maybe it was sea-focused, trade-connected, good at measuring seasons, skilled at building in stone and metal, and dependent on stable coasts and predictable harvests. But sea levels rose after the last ice age by more than 100 meters globally. And that doesn't politely preserve harbors and river mouths. Why wouldn't the best evidence end up underwater, scattered, buried, or simply out of reach, then later overlooked because "we would have found it" sounds convincing from dry land? Still, it's important to keep the skepticism honest. The Antikythera mechanism doesn't prove a lost global empire, and Newgrange doesn't prove secret observatories. Most archaeologists will tell you these are products of human skill, culture, and time. That mainstream explanation is not an enemy, and often it's the best one. Yet why are we so certain there can be no missing chapters between skillful and industrial, when history shows progress can jump, stall, and regress? And when many findings get explained away too quickly simply because they don't fit the cleanest narrative, consider the emotional side, because that's the part people pretend doesn't matter. If we are not the first, it doesn't just change a timeline, it changes how you feel in your own era. There's awe in it, but also unease, because it means intelligence isn't a guarantee of continuity. But why should that idea frighten us more than it steadies us, when humility is sometimes the only calm response to a planet that keeps rewriting its own surface? And maybe the most practical question is the simplest one. What would we learn, even if we never prove anything? If earlier societies could be connected by trade without being unified by conquest, that mirrors how ideas move today: fast, informal, overlapping. If earlier people tracked sky cycles across generations, that mirrors our dependence on measurement and forecasting. Yet our version runs hotter and faster. And environmental strain isn't a metaphor for us. Why wouldn't the thought of a vanished predecessor make us more careful with the conditions that keep our web intact? Some people will hear this and demand a verdict. Yes or no, first or not first, lost civilization or only stories. That demand is understandable because uncertainty is uncomfortable. But in real research, uncertain is sometimes the correct answer for a long time, and forcing certainty can be a kind of self-deception. Why the resistance to letting the question stay open, especially when the evidence is scattered, underfunded, and often dismissed without serious investigation, the moment it sounds like it might connect too many dots? So here is the thought to hold gently without turning it into a crusade. Maybe the message from the past isn't a single artifact or a perfect map. Maybe it's the pattern itself. Cities can drown, machines can vanish, records can burn, and myths can carry warnings when libraries can't. But if that pattern is real, it suggests something sobering and strangely hopeful at the same time. What if we are not the first dawn, just the latest attempt at building a world that can remember itself? Why do we keep finding survivals in the wrong places? Underwater, in myths, in odd devices, if the story is fully settled? Why do we feel both pulled toward the idea and pushed away from it, as if curiosity and caution are wrestling inside the same sentence? And if a world-spanning web can vanish once, what would it take for ours to endure long enough to become more than a brief layer in the ground? We've moved through deep time together, and we've let uncertainty sit where certainty usually wants to settle. If you've stayed this far, you've done something rare. You've allowed questions to wander without demanding instant closure. Let that calm stay with you. Let the mind rest on the idea that the past may be wider than the textbook, and the future depends on what we choose to notice now. Ease your thoughts back from proof and argument, and simply drift with wonder for a while, because sometimes the most honest ending is a quiet one.